In part one of this talk, I would like to introduce the inner dynamics of commoning. The Stern Review on the Economics of Climate Change claims that reducing emissions by more than 1% annually would generate a severe economic crisis. And yet, climate analysts tell us we need to reduce carbon emissions by 5.3% annually to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius. There is no evidence that decoupling economic growth from environmental pressures is possible, and although politicians tout technical solutions to climate crisis, efficiency gains from technology usually increase the absolute amount of energy consumed. The stark reality is that capitalist accumulation cannot continue. The global economy must shrink. Fortunately, there exist many experiments with non-capitalist modes of assessing and exchanging value, sharing goods and services, and making decisions, which can help us transition to a more sustainable political economy based on principles of degrowth. One of the best ways to generate non-capitalist subjects, objects, and spaces comes from the commons. According to David Bollier, as the grand centralized market state systems of the 20th century begin to implode through their own dysfunctionality, the commons will more swiftly step into the breach by offering more local, convivial, and trusted systems of survival. Already there is evidence of this happening. The commons is spreading rapidly among communities hit hardest by recent financial crises and the failures of austerity policies. Many crisis-stricken areas, especially in Europe and South America, have developed solidarity economies to self-manage resources in response to the failures of the state and market, thus insulating themselves from systemic shocks in the future. It seems likely that a community's capacity to share will be crucial to its survival on a wetter, hotter, and meaner planet. Among researchers, there are several different ways to define the commons. In most cases, the commons are understood to be objects. For example, the atmosphere and ocean are global commons, because they are resources we must all learn to regulate and share collectively. This notion of the commons as material resource goes hand in hand with another notion that the commons can be both material and immaterial, a product of either nature or culture. Using this second definition to highlight the importance of the immaterial commons enhances our appreciation for aspects often undervalued by traditional economic measures. Together, both these perspectives are helpful in devising political and economic strategies for managing the commons, which remains the dominant interest of most common researchers and policymakers. Nevertheless, both definitions ignore that fundamentally the commons are generated by social practices. In other words, there are no commons without commoners to enact them. From an enactive perspective, commons are not objects, but actions, generated by many different actors in relationship. Commons-based systems depend upon self-governance and reciprocity. People rely on and take responsibility for each other, finding common solutions to their problems. This allows communities to define the parameters and attractors for guiding their own economic behavior, affording people more autonomy and greater opportunity for protecting and cultivating shared values. Commons-based systems cut across the private-public market-state dichotomy and present alternative economic arrangements defined by communities. In Patterns of Commoning, David Bollier and Silke Helfrich argue that commons cannot be entirely encapsulated in a concept or definition, because they are not things. Rather, they are another way of being, thinking about, and shaping the world. Commoning is about sharing the responsibility for stewardship with the intent to construct a fair, free, and sustainable world, a goal which is all the more important given the unequal distribution of risks posed by intensifying climate change. The inner dynamics of commoning preclude simple definitions of the commons, because as a practice, commoning shapes who we become. Particular commons can only be understood in their actual embedded social and ecological circumstances, and in the subjective and emotional experience of those involved in commoning. Both nature and culture are generative of the commons, and commoning describes the practice of responsibly relating to human and non-human beings alike. Commoning thus not only creates sustainable systems, it also has the potential to birth entire new lifeways and worldviews premised on relationality and reciprocity. It generates worlds where we commune with each other and with the environment, as if every object is also a subject, a being worthy of our respect. To avoid civilizational collapse, Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi says, we need to accept a relational worldview that affirms subjectivity across all life forms and indeed the cosmos itself, so that we view everything as a subject with its own experience and intrinsic value. It also demands the development of an ethics that respects the dignity and agency of non-human actors, both living and non-living. Extending commoning beyond peer-to-peer economics so that we extend care to every being becomes possible if it is enacted by commoners who follow an ethics of intrasubjectivity. An ethics of intrasubjectivity demands understanding that nature is not an element separated from us, but co-produced in our daily interactions. Climate change can more often be immediately experienced by understanding how one's daily life is already always implicated in the co-production of unsustainable nature cultures. In part 2 of this talk, I would like to explore how Buddhism and contemplative practice afford resources for developing an ethics of intrasubjectivity in the commons, by examining the relation between commoning, Buddhism, and contemplative practice. An ethics of intrasubjectivity distinguishes itself from the notion of interdependence, insofar as it highlights how relationships are not only externally dependent, but internally dependent and always present to one's inner awareness. Intrasubjectivity thus explains how all beings are related to you vis-à-vis your experience of them. The deeper we connect with our own suffering, the more we realize our suffering's constituent relation to the suffering of others, and the more we act to serve others as extensions of ourselves. An ethics of intrasubjectivity allows us to more intimately understand how we co-produce nature cultures, and how they may more positively address systemic social ecological crises. Developing an ethics of care that extends to the many differently abled human and non-human beings in the Anthropocene entails querying our notions of subjectivity and agency to answer complex questions about what it means to be human, whose lives matter, how we gift and protect human dignity, and how we envision the collective conditions of transformation toward a more convivial and hospitable world. Commoning is a mode of relating to each other, both materially and interpersonally, through an enhanced understanding of our non-separateness, our codependence, and our togetherness. As described by Ubuntu, I am because you are. Applied to the Buddhist figure of the Bodhisattva, one might understand that my liberation is co-produced by your liberation, as an entanglement of our worldly and spiritual fates. Expanding inclusivity becomes about enhancing everyone's freedom, not just the marginalized. And since consciousness is supported and maintained by material infrastructures and desires, material transformation and conscious transformation go hand in hand. Though little recognized, commoning also has this dual valence as a pattern of both material and social spiritual exchange, an exchange between individuals and communities who self-organize and take responsibility for one another. Deep resonances already exist between the inner dynamics of commoning and Buddhist and contemplative mindsets. For example, one of Buddhism's core commitments is to ensure the safety of all beings. Committed Buddhists may thus view diverse forms of commoning as appropriate responses to climate change. When the state and market do not offer security and refuge, we can provide it for each other, and individual irresponsibility can be overcome by taking greater collective responsibility. According to this view, self-care becomes intrinsically tied to other care, and exchanging one's self-interest for the interests of others is re-envisioned as caring for oneself in service to the community. As the Bodhisattva would say, liberation will come for all of us or none of us. In the case of climate change, awakened bodhisattvas embody the literal meaning of compassion as suffering with. They feel the anxiety of the aggrieved and the aggressed, not only the ones who suffer tomorrow, but already the ones who suffer today. Climate change is not a Chinese hoax or a distant possibility. It is a lived reality experienced by millions, dare I say billions, of climate refugees, the impoverished, and the famished of both today and tomorrow. Awakening not only means suffering this collective suffering, but being compelled to compassionate action. Compassion, in this sense, is not understood exclusively as a subjective disposition, as empathetic resonance. It is, as Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi calls it, conscientious compassion, because it gives birth to a fierce determination to uplift others, to tackle the causes of their suffering, and to establish the social, economic, and political conditions that will enable everyone to flourish and live in harmony. Studies on virtual reality show that people who feel what life is like from the perspective of plants and animals are more motivated to behave in environmentally friendly ways. Embodying compassion means acting with compassion. Taking responsibility for one's active involvement in the Anthropocene also requires that one contemplate the relationship to everyday objects as if they were all in us. As Karen Lipfin illustrates, meditatively walking around shopping malls can catalyze greater awareness than meditating on the cushion. Not only does my consumption afford me privilege, but my privilege to consume without regard to its social and ecological consequences jeopardizes the survival and well-being of marginalized populations, human and non-human alike. The practice of contemplating the commons is a refusal to disregard these costs. Tracing commodity change can also be understood as another way to better understand the karma of one's consumption. Whereas global capitalism thrives off abstraction, separating producers and consumers by great distances and timescales, contemplating the commons makes the abstract concrete. By contemplating one's use of everyday items like computers and iPhones, one sees the histories of colonialism, racism, and environmental harm implicated in their use and production. Likewise, in contemplating climate change, contemplative practices can make the abstract statistical analyses of typical climate communications into concrete experiences. This can help sensitize us to the civilizational upheaval underfoot, so that we can move beyond denial toward realistic, morally informed action. The capacity to disregard the suffering of today is predicated on the abject neglect of those who already suffer, and who will suffer even more tomorrow. Contemplating so-called dark realities can help us connect to the commons. When we're faced with darkness, if our impulse is to run away or eliminate it from sight, rather than probing deeper and understanding it, then the culture of positivity and hope we've built becomes an ideology that squashes critical inquiry and compassionate responses to whatever it prefers to disregard. On the other hand, confronting injustice through contemplative practice allows us to better understand and empathize with the world beyond our privilege and gives us the energy to fight injustice rather than turn a blind eye to it. Since denial is the most common coping strategy and one promoted by our culture of knee-jerk positivity and hope, people need to be provoked by the strange, dark, and undesirable. After all, the first noble truth in Buddhism is that people have to sit with suffering. Timothy Morton's Dark Ecology extends this truth toward our understanding of intrasubjectivity. He says, the struggle to have solidarity with life forms is the struggle to include specters and spectrality. Dark ecology is about how do you actually coexist nonviolently with as many beings as possible. Occupying vulnerability and suffering are in fact political acts of solidarity, because exposing ourselves to injustice allows us to relinquish our position of privilege, to liberate the oppressed, and provide the conditions for their well-being. This is an important shift to be making, since contemplating today's injustices can allow us to recognize false promises. It would help us recognize, for instance, that green tech fixes that refuse to acknowledge the embodied energy costs of new technologies hold out the promise of a future predicated on the impoverishment of the present. But if we embody an ecological self, Ruben Habito says, then we can experience the fact that the mountains are being denuded, the rivers are heavily polluted, and the great wide earth is racked with pain. For now, this concludes the end of my short talk, but if you are interested in further exploring the inner dynamics of commoning and sustainable transformations, I welcome you to join a new open-source platform for ethics-based and contemplative research on social transformation and sustainability, called the Contemplative Commons. The intention of our community is to connect ethics and contemplative research in social science disciplines such as sociology, economics, political science, environmental studies, and media studies to various other stakeholders in government and civil society. while offering a common pool of resources and opportunities for conducting future research on these topics. We welcome anyone who shares an interest and background in ethics-based and contemplative-based social scientific research, who is attuned to the need for social ecological transformation, and who wants to explore the development of ethics and contemplative practices in the context of the Anthropocene and systems change. For more information, please see the text below this video to see links to our project webpage and social media pages. And thank you for listening to this short lecture.